one way or another, this war is either going to go into NATO countries or it's going to go into Russia proper, and a nuke is going to fly. And the best defense that we can possibly have needs to be erected before that happens. So that's kind of midterm. Shorter term, dealing with the war itself, the Russians are not going to back down at this point, even if everyone immediately stops using Russian crude. But the goal has to be at this point to make sure that the Russians have problems rearming using third countries, whether it's Iran or China or North Korea. And the best way to do that is to completely destroy the income. So we need to move into a position where we're talking about a naval blockade that simply keeps Russian oil and natural gas off the market completely, and that shuts it in at the point of production in Siberia so it can not come back in anything less than a decade time frame. That is a step that no one in Europe has been willing to consider because there were a number of countries in Central Europe that were still dependent upon it. But as we get into the second half of this year, the only country in Europe that is still dependent on Russian energy is Hungary. And to be perfectly blunt, the position in Europe is hardening, and the general position towards Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is that guy.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are catching up with the geopolitical analyst Peter Zeihan. Peter is a best-selling author whose most recent book is The End of the World is Just the Beginning, Mapping the Collapse of Globalization. He's a regular commentator on the war in Ukraine and Putin's Russia. Peter, good to have you back. Thanks for your time.
Great to be here.
Now, the results of the Russian presidential elections were a foregone conclusion.
Sorry, you called it election. That's funny.
I know. Thank you. I knew you'd react like that. The landslide results, they exceeded expectations even though. What are your takeaways from those results and the way President Putin and other global leaders have reacted to them?
Russia hasn't had a competitive election since 1996. So to call this an election and say that it signifies anything is kind of a joke.
So at Putin's election celebrations, he placed the FSB front and center as a defender of Russia-occupied Ukraine. Is Putin likely to rely more on his old security allies over the Siloviki, the hard men, as he tightens his grip on Russia, do you think?
Well, I would argue that the FSB is part of the Siloviki. The FSB, two things. Number one, the core of Putin's power is an alliance between the intelligence officials, primarily the FSB, and organized crime. So they've always been front and center. They've always been core to his political coalition. And then second, if you remember back to not just the Soviet period, but the Tsarist period before it, the FSB and its predecessors, the KGB and so on, their primary job isn't international affairs. It's been patrolling the population. Russia and the Soviet Union before it are not nation states. They are multi-ethnic empires. And part of how you hold that together is you put enough intelligence agents into every ethnic minority's populations that they can sniff out subversion whenever and wherever it pops up. Well, from the Russian point of view, there are now 4 provinces in Ukraine that are in definite need of monitoring. So the idea that the FSB is only going to have a stronger role moving forward, that's kind of baked in now.
Do you think this is okay, I will use the word, but like that, election, is actually taking Russia just further down the direction that it's already on, the trajectory of basically complete autocracy, to be in the hands of a dictatorship?
Ever since the formation of United Russia, the party that Putin runs in the mid-2000s, there has been nothing in Russia that is even adjacent to the democratic process. The only difference this time around is that everybody is calling a spade a spade. There were any number of countries in the last 20 years, Germany, the United States, France, Britain, all of us, for various reasons, found reasons that we needed to get along with Russia. Maybe it was financial flows. Maybe it was energy flows. Maybe it was getting support, military support into a place like Afghanistan and needing the logistic support. We don't need anything from Russia anymore. And we're willing to be a lot more honest with ourselves and out loud.
The election sparked a new wave of attacks even before it took place from Ukraine inside Russia, particularly in the Belgorod and the Kursk areas, ground incursions by Russian forces loyal to Kyiv, drone attacks, according to Russia's defense ministry, missile and rocket attacks. They even, this is the Russian ministry, they claimed that there was a US-made Patriot fired. Now, according to Reuters agency, Putin has said Russia has its own plans to respond, but it won't attack population civilian targets inside Ukraine. It's an extraordinary statement, isn't it?
Yeah, no, the Russians have been deliberately trying to cause power outages and famine in Ukraine since the war started. So, I would do anything with that. The question is, what can they do to prevent this sort of attack? Partisans are very effective in a territory that is only relatively lightly populated, and by European standards, that's the entire Russian periphery. Especially when you consider that you have at least 10 million Ukrainians who speak Russian fluently as their first language, and then probably another 15 million who speak it fluently as a second language. So the pool that the Ukrainians can pull from in order to do these sort of irregular attacks is robust. And when you've got places like Belgorod that are within artillery range, you've got a triple attractiveness. I mean, number one, you've got the Russian populations within Ukraine that are fighting for the Ukrainians. Number two, you can support them with conventional means. And number three, if this war is ever going to be resolved to Ukraine's satisfaction, the logistical places within Russia that are used to launch the conflict into Ukraine have to be neutralized. Well, one of those is Belgorod. So one way or another, there's going to be a lot more shooting there.
Do you think it's something that's going to escalate then?
It's definitely going to escalate. I don't want to say whether it's going to be successful or not, but for Ukraine to continue to exist as an independent state, Belgorod has to be neutralized one way or the other.
Now, you estimate that Russia could keep the war going in Ukraine for another 6 to 8 years. And Putin is now selling these sham election results as a mandate to continue the war with the will of the people behind him. Will he keep it going for as long as he is president, do you think?
The Russians, there's an ego issue here. I don't mean to say that there's not, but this primary issue is strategic. The Russians are in demographic collapse, not as fast as, say, the Chinese or the Germans or the Koreans, but it's pretty bad. And they're going to cease to have the ability to carry out an offensive military operation within the decade. I'd say that 6 to 8 years is kind of the window that I've identified. That's why I've put that benchmark there. That means they have to make it to Warsaw and the Danube in that amount of time. If they don't, they have an unanchored Western periphery. So this is about rebuilding the strategic picture that we had during the Soviet period while they still can. It doesn't matter if Putin were to die tomorrow. The regime is going to continue this war one way or another, and any sort of ceasefire would only be there to reposition and reprovision in order to launch a new assault.
When you talk about reaching the Danube or Warsaw, it's interesting because I was talking to a Russian historian or a historian on Russia just a few minutes ago who was telling me that he actually didn't believe that Putin really had territorial ambitions beyond Ukraine. So you are in the camp that says absolutely that is not the case.
Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, the northeastern sliver of Romania, and the eastern half of Poland, plus the Caucasus, plus Central Asia. We're only about midway through this process. This is the 9th military conflict the Russians have launched since 1989 in an attempt to rebuild that outer crustal fortification. This won't be the last.
The Institute for the Study of War, according to them, Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, has addressed the Russian military board to outline structural reforms to the Russian military while expanding Russia's conventional capabilities in preparation for a potential future large-scale war with NATO. I mean, he may well be doing that, but that is also a far cry, though, from actually signalling any intention.
Shoigu has arguably, in the last 10 years, stolen personally 1/3 of the Russian procurement budget, and his allies have probably stolen another third. So if Shoigu is involved, think of it more as the announcing of a corruption gravy train than any meaningful policy. I agree that the Russians need to do that if they're going to prosecute this war more successfully, but that doesn't mean that Shoigu is a part of the solution. The only reason he is still defense minister is he's a personal friend of Vladimir Putin going back decades. He is not a competent defense minister. He's certainly not a reformer. I'd argue he's Ukraine's greatest ally in this war to this point. I'd argue that Shoigu is the greatest ally of the Ukrainians to this point because he's so incompetent.
And just to go back, Peter, to what you were saying about the territorial intentions that Putin has, can Russia be deterred, or do you think that this push is inevitable?
They're going to try regardless. The question is whether they can be stopped. I mean, the position of the Baltic trio states has always been the same. We know that the Russians will never stop They have to be stopped. And they're right. And now that Finland and Sweden are in NATO, that position is largely echoed by the Finns and the Swedes as well. And of course, the Poles are forthright on their position. So we're seeing this dawning recognition across Europe that this is going to get worse before it gets better. And everyone is going to have to dig deep in order to stop the Russians. And I look at what the French have been doing and saying over the last few weeks in that light, and that there has been this sea change in attitude towards what needs to be done. And even in Germany, the open discussion of preparing the next generation for war, this would have never happened 2 years ago, much less 4 years ago.
I mean, you mentioned France. They do seem to have entered this war of words with Russia over the possibility of putting international troops into Ukraine to support the Ukrainians. While the Ukrainians say they don't need troops, they just need the equipment at the moment and the weaponry. But Russian sources are now claiming that they say France is preparing to send around 2,000 soldiers to Ukraine. Why would they say this? And what impact does this kind of rhetoric have?
When you're on the western end of Europe and you don't have any strategic weaknesses that you need to worry about as regards to the Russian theater, it's all a question of how you view the broader picture. And from a certain point of view, the French are a little bit like the Americans. They can afford to take the long view on most issues because they're not directly threatened by most issues. So in this specific case, the French aid to Ukraine officially is small, but that's largely because unofficially they don't report it because they want it to be a surprise. And things like their Caesar artillery have been absolutely instrumental in helping the Ukrainians stabilize the front line in the last 6 months. Now we're getting into a situation where we've had a mindset shift in France. They realize that all of their corporate exposure to all their corporate exposure to Russia that has been built up since 1989 has collapsed. So they no longer have any economic skin in the game. And so they can afford to take a purely strategic position. They've also made the gut-wrenching admission that the future of Europe is going to be radically different, because the Europe that we have today with the euro and the border where it is not sustainable. The demographic situation is ugly. The strategic position with the United States because of deglobalization is weakening, and Europe needs a new definition. Well, the French have always seen the European Union as a political project. Their thinking is if they can shove the economic conversations to the side a little bit, and now we'll make it a political military project. Well, France is the natural leader in that group now that the United Kingdom is gone. There's no one in Europe who would assert otherwise. And that means taking more of a leadership position in Ukraine. And they can do that in a very low risk manner. They can spin up their military industrial complex a lot faster than most of the other European countries. And if you start putting French troops in Ukraine, 3 things come from that. Number 1, preference for French equipment. Number 2, the ability for French and Ukrainian troops to cross-train. We've been thinking in the West about Ukraine as a bit of a charity case. From the French point of view, France hasn't been in a hot war in a while. They didn't participate in the American war on terror aside from some special forces. If they can actually learn modern military technology from the Ukrainians, that's the equivalent to, say, when the Europeans engaged in the Crimean War at the start of the industrial era, or the Europeans sent observers to the American Civil War in the same period. This is about learning how to fight for 30, 50, 70 years from now. And that's a smart play. And all they would have to do is maybe park some troops near Transnistria or on the Belarusian border in order to provide a bulwark for the Ukrainians who could then redeploy to the front line. There's a lot of upside here for the French. This is not just bombast. This is a real strategic discussion.
On the position of the European Union, the president of the European Council has said that they should consider transitioning to a wartime economy and focus on effective implementation and enforcement of sanctions against Russia. And it also now seems, finally, that the EU is poised to unlock the profits on these frozen Russian assets to buy weapons for Ukraine. Do you think the EU is finally getting its act together and becoming, I suppose, aware that it may have to support Ukraine without US aid in the future?
I think you're right. It's ironic that it took Lowenbobart in the United States and Donald Trump to force the Europeans into this conclusion. I think we were going to get there anyway. I think eventually it would have been obvious to everyone that even if the United States was completely committed every single day, that Ukraine still needed a lot of help, and that help has to come from Europe. So getting the leaders of the European institutions, which until recently were all about global cooperation, globalization, market access, and absolutely nothing military, singing a very different tune and talking about a German-style war economy, like Nazi German-style war economy, that's a breathtaking change. I can't say as an American I'm entirely comfortable with it, but I think it's a very logical extension of where we find ourselves now. And if Ukraine is going to survive, it is necessary. I don't doubt that when properly committed, the Europeans have the ability to do this. They do. It will lead into a lot of other interesting directions, though.
The Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, he recently visited the Black Sea Fleet, and he ordered increasing training and firepower, including the installation of large caliber machine guns on vessels to defend against Ukraine's air and naval drones. For him to say this, and for the Black Sea Fleet commander and the head of the Russian Navy to be fired or stepped down, it does show the Ukrainians have given Russia something to worry about in this area.
Let's start with the tactical and then look at the strategic. The problem with taking out Ukrainian seaborne drones is angle. So if you've got a larger ship, whether it's a landing ship or a missile cruiser, you are designed to deal with things over the horizon, or you're designed to make a beach landing, do roll on, roll off. You don't expect to be swarmed by small things operating nearly at the waterline. And so angling something down in order to attack an incoming small vessel, especially at night, is nearly impossible with the weapons that your ship was built with. So putting on high caliber machine guns that can do that depressed angle is really your only option. But it means, for example, having ammo just stacked up on the deck, which has other problems. So it's a necessary change, but it's one that indicates that the Russian position in the western half of the Black Sea is already gone. And any ship that would be considered a pre-war surface combatant that the Americans might have had a little respect for, those are basically having to be shifted up over to Novorossiysk and parts even further east to stay out of range of these things. But it's also part of a broader strategic issue here. There's a 4-part strategy at the moment for what the Ukrainians are doing with the drones and using these modified jet skis to go after Russian naval vessels. That's only part 1. Part 2 is to compensate for the lack of American support at the moment, and that's to develop these 1 and 2 pound bombs that are carrying something that's the size of a grenade in order to replace artillery. And so when the Russians do their human wave tactics, you just send in several dozen, if not several hundred, of these small drones that are personnel in nature. But the more strategic issues are things like the Scythe, which is basically a garage project. People basically taking aluminum and plywood, slapping a warhead on it, and then sending it off. And the Beavers, which have, I think it's about a 600-kilometer range, and using those to target energy infrastructure within 600 kilometers of the Ukrainian borders. They've done that against 15 facilities in just the last month and did significant damage to a number of them. But where things get a little sexy, and technically against American recommendations, is they're very clearly using those Phoenix Ghost shoulder-launched drones that were designed originally for anti-tank operations, and they're giving them to special forces and sending them 1,500 kilometers into Russia to then launch attacks at distillation towers on refineries well out of range of anything they can launch from Ukraine. The damage that has been done so far is significant, and the Ukrainians are very clearly ramping up those sort of operations. And you're talking about damage to an economic sector, energy exports, refined energy exports, that earn more for the Russians as a percentage of their overall budget than corporate taxes generate for Western countries. So the Ukrainians have found a very low-cost way of doing far more damage to the Russian economy than anything that has happened with the sanctions so far.
So when the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Alexander Syrsky, says that he considers the development of unmanned systems as a key technological innovation to gain advantage over the enemy, and that this is a priority. Is that exactly what you're talking about, or is this actually an intention to develop this further and go for even better quality in this area?
I would argue both. Now, the Phoenix ghosts that come from the United States, those are the shoulder-launched ones. Those are great for what they're using them for now. It's not that they were bad against armor. They were basically an RPG at range. But they're discovering that there's a lot of sensitive spots that you can use with those. And so they've largely been removed from the battlefield and now being used for economic sabotage. The Beaver is 100% a Ukrainian special that they designed from the ground up, and it's only in its second generation. So I can only imagine what they're going to do for range and payload and accuracy moving forward. The Scythe is literally 1,000 Ukrainian dudes making these things in their garages. And if that gets any sort of regularization on a normal supply chain, you're talking about a much heavier warhead being able to be delivered at more than 400 kilometers range. That may very well be the way they break those internal logistical systems in Russia, most notably in Belgorod and Rostov-on-Don.
And on the ground in Ukraine, what Russia has always had is manpower and people to throw in waves along the contested frontline areas. How do you see, following this election, the idea of mobilization being popular or possible with the support of the people?
The election was not a referendum on the war. There was no public
He
support
tried to use it
expressed.
like that, though, didn't
I
he?
mean, exactly. I mean, that's the talking point, and that will be the propaganda. But I think everyone in Russia is pretty inured to the government's statements on things like that at this point. I mean, I'm amused at the one precinct in Russia where Putin did not get a commanding majority in the votes. They ordered a recount. It's just. It was just silly. That said, conscription is absolutely coming. It's just going to be stealth for now until such time as Putin feels that the propaganda has really dug in enough and had its impact. They're just going to do it on the sly. And they've shown for the last year and a half that they can conscript in excess of 30, 40,000 men a month and not call it conscription. And the population puts up with it.
Where are we at with the American funding, the $60 billion aid package? Because at this monthly meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group at Ramstein in Germany, the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, he warned that Ukraine's survival was in danger. He was trying to convince allies of the US's commitment to Ukraine. But then the Republican House of Representatives Speaker, Mike Johnson, he refuses to call a vote on it. Last time we spoke, you'd hoped that Ukraine would be getting assistance by April, I think. Have you changed your mind at all?
I think that might be a little bit too optimistic. The discharge petition that allows Congress people to go around the Speaker is in play. And if we don't see action from the Speaker in the next couple of weeks, we probably will see the discharge petition come into play. But if it were to come into play today, it would still be a month probably before we got the vote. And we've had something change here. Speaker Johnson has had a bit of a heart-to-heart meeting with the hardliners who are opposing any sort of aid. And he has put a series of things on the voting docket that even they realize have to happen, mostly related to budget issues. And so we finally do have a budget deal in the United States to continue funding the government, which is something that we're, I think, on our fourth one in the last 16 months. Anyway, it's finally happening. And in the same press conference that he announced that this was now going to be available for a vote, he talked about the tyranny of Russia and what it means to fight oppression and terrorism, and how Ukraine is one of the great lights standing against the darkness. And of course, the United States is going to step in and help. And you could tell that the people who have been stopping Ukrainian aid to this point were choking on their bile, but none of them said anything. So if Johnson is true to his word, we will see. We should have a vote on the House floor within the next 2 weeks. And at that point, the Senate is expected to approve it relatively quickly, and Biden will sign into law almost a heartbeat later. But even on that, for American Congress accelerated time frame, that wouldn't suggest meaningful aid gets to Ukraine in April. So that's kind of the quasi-good, quasi-bad news. The better news is that Congress has no problem passing funding to get the U.S. defense complex running on a faster speed. So at least looking forward 6 to 12 months, the United States will have more of the production that is necessary, not just for itself and to restock the allies who have supplied the Ukraine while the United States has sat out, but probably even have some spare stuff to send Ukraine in addition to what was already planned.
And just finally, Peter, what do you think the West's strategy, its long-term strategy, should be towards Russia? Because you believe, irrespective of these results in Russia, the days of the current regime are numbered.
Well, from an American point of view, as opposed to a Western point of view, I would triple investment in strategic defense initiatives and anti-missile defense systems. Push one way or another. This war is either going to go into NATO countries or it's going to go into Russia proper, and a nuke is going to fly. And the best defense that we can possibly have needs to be erected before that happens. So that's kind of midterm. Shorter term, dealing with the war itself, the Russians are not going to back down at this point, even if everyone immediately stops using Russian crude. But the goal has to be at this point to make sure that the Russians have problems rearming using third countries, whether it's Iran or China or North Korea. And the best way to do that is to completely destroy the income. So we need to move into a position where we're talking about a naval blockade that simply keeps Russian oil and natural gas off the market completely, and that shuts it in at the point of production in Siberia so it can not come back in anything less than a decade time frame. That is a step that no one in Europe has been willing to consider because there were a number of countries in Central Europe that were still dependent upon it. But as we get into the second half of this year, the only country in Europe that is still dependent on Russian energy is Hungary. And to be perfectly blunt, the position in Europe is hardening, and the general position towards Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is that guy. And we are getting very close to the Europeans stripping the Hungarians of voting rights, of funding, and making it so that they can't veto policy any longer. So I would expect with this shift in rhetoric at the very top of not just Russian governments, but the EU Secretary itself, that we're going to have a significant change on enforcement of sanctions and the nature of the sanctions in the second half of the year.
Peter Zeihan, great to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.